だいまより国連大学サステナビリティ高等研究所特定非営利活動法人ミレニアムプロミスジャパン共催講演独立行政法人国際協力機構外務省国際協力60周年記念事業認定シンポジウム持続可能性とポスト2015年開発アジェンダの統合を目指してを開会いたします。私は本日の司会進行を務めさせていただきますミレニアムプロミスジャパン理事長の鈴木理恵子と申します。本日は風邪のためちょっとお聞き苦しい点がございますかと案じておりますが、あらかじめお詫び申し上げます。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much, and welcome to the United Nations University headquarters here in Tokyo. We have some very distinguished guests with us, and it gives me the opportunity to say how lucky the university is to be headquartered in Japan. About 50 years ago, Japan developed the notion that it should host one of the UN programs and agencies. And we are very lucky that in the discussion on the creation of the United Nations University, there was a coincidence in time with this Japanese desire, and that we are thus the lucky ones in Tokyo. And we're very grateful to all of our Japanese friends and supporters, a number of whom are in the room today. Particularly today, I'm grateful to Shinichi Kitaoka, who is a distinguished ambassador, a distinguished academic, a university president, and also the president of the Millennium Promise Japan. It was his idea and the idea of others at Millennium Promise Japan that today's symposium would take place here at UNU. So I'm very grateful for that, Shinichi, and we're honored to receive you and your colleagues today. And I'm delighted you've agreed to join another UNU project, which is coming together in a couple of weeks. We have an excellent panel for the discussion to follow our keynote speaker, and Jeff, I'm very glad that you've agreed also to be the discussant of that panel. And the panel will be chaired by a relative newcomer, or moderated, I should say, by a relative newcomer to the United Nations University, Professor Kazuhiko Takemoto, who is an unusual academic in a way, because for a long time he was an official of the Japanese government, became Vice Minister of Environment, but then, instead of moving on to a think tank and thinking deep thoughts and writing short papers, he actually went back to school and did doctoral studies, produced a long and distinguished thesis, and only then came to us as director of our institute in Tokyo. So we're very glad to have him. His subject of specialization is environmental, and indeed the work of our institute, the Institute of Advanced Studies on Sustainability here in Tokyo, focuses on a number of issues that are primarily environmental. For example, education for sustainable development, natural disaster risk, management reduction, and so on which there will be a major conference in Japan shortly. Indeed, on education for sustainable development, there will also be a major conference in Japan in November at Nagoya. It's not the only institute of UNU that works on the environment, but it's the principal one. Our institute in Bonn also works on dimensions of climate change, amongst other things, also works on elements of environmental risk, And two of our institutes work on issues related to water. Our institute in Dresden on the integrated management of water, soil, and waste, a major challenge, but also a major opportunity in the developing world. And our institute in Hamilton, Canada, which works on water for development more generally. We have a wonderful keynote speaker with us today, a colleague at the United Nations, but he's active on so many levels. Jeff Sachs is a professor of sustainable development and health policy and management at Columbia University, but that description doesn't actually encompass even a fraction of what he does across the world. He has advised not just the current Secretary General and continues to advise him on Millennium Development Goals and the development goals to follow, the Sustainable Development Goals, but he also played that role with Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon's predecessor. He has directed a number of institutions, a number of projects. I think many of you will know of the Millennium Villages project, which has been so influential in Africa and elsewhere. He's directed the Earth Institute, which has achieved global renown. I'm not going to read you his CV. It would take forever. It would embarrass him, and it would shame the rest of us, because he's much more energetic than nearly any of us. But I will remind you that while he's very focused on issues of public health, of sustainable development, he's actually an economist by original discipline, and I'm glad to see he's returning to write about economics every now and then, because we need you on that subject, Jeff. He's also an activist, and he's not content to study. He also wants to see action flowing from what we know and what we discover as we go on. So without banging on, I'll summarize Jeff Sachs as a global public good, and I'll leave the podium to him. Welcome, Jeff.
早速シンポジウムを始めてまいります。最初に基調講演をいただきますのは、コロンビア大学地球研究所所長のジェフリー・サックス教授でございます。教授のご紹介はただいまマローン学長から詳細にいただきましたので省略させていただきます。それでは皆様ジェフリー・サックス教授を拍手でお迎えください。
Thank you very much, Rieko and Director David Malone. Let me say what a great honor and pleasure it is to be here today, and also to see many friends and colleagues and fellow activists in research and in development practice. So I could not be more pleased to be here. And I've also met some of the students, and I hope that in our discussion I can get to know more of the wonderful students in the sustainability program here. It's really a pleasure. And it's a special pleasure to be here at a very important time for global development. Because as everybody knows, we are finishing a 15-year period of the Millennium Development Goals. So that would be time to take stock in any event. But without even catching our breath, and even before the Millennium Development Goals formally end on December 31st, 2015, we will adopt new Sustainable Development Goals on September 23rd, 2015, a little less than a year from now, at what will be one of the most important gatherings on development in recent diplomatic history. Indeed, the plans now are for 3 full days of head of state meetings on development in September next year at the United Nations. The feeling is that the agenda is so important, so distinctive, and so complex that even a normal one-day summit will not do justice to the challenges, and so this will be the longest head of state summit ever. We are therefore at the brink of a year of extremely important global diplomacy. Indeed, next year aims to adopt not only the new goals to follow the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, but also to accomplish 2 other very significant undertakings, all interconnected. In July of next year will be a summit on international finance for development, which will be the first such meeting on the financial system for development since Monterrey, Mexico in 2002. Of course, the issues of development finance are complex, contentious, and also to be made even more complicated by the addition of climate change financing to the global discussion. And then in 14 months from now, 2 months after adopting the new Sustainable Development Goals, world leaders will meet in Paris in December 2015 at the 21st Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the so-called COP21. And as I will emphasize in my remarks, this will be the most important climate summit, certainly of our generation. If it succeeds, we have a chance to head off grave damage from climate change. If it fails, and it very well could fail, we will have lost that chance because we won't have another opportunity like next year to try to honor the commitments that we've made to keep global warming below the 2 degrees Celsius goal that now has been set by the world's governments. I can't remember another time when so many crucial development issues have all come together on the same calendar. And yet, this is our reality. If this weren't complicated enough, of course, the world is facing multiple urgent crises and areas of strife and violence that really spread for thousands of miles now throughout the Middle East, Western Asia, Central Asia, the Horn of Africa, and across North Africa and the Sahel. So even if there were no development agenda, the global diplomatic agenda is packed. And all of this means that our efforts are especially difficult and especially important right now. The purpose of my remarks today is to try to explain this agenda somehow in the 30 minutes of talk and then the conversation and discussion that will follow in a way that can be helpful for us as participants in this process and for this great United Nations University as a major protagonist of understanding all of these issues. I'd like to start with this graphic depiction of the world just to remind ourselves of the most distinctive aspect of our world today, and that is its intense interconnectedness. This is a graphic in which the white lines are the airline routes of the world. The dark blue lines are the major shipping lines, and the bright dots are, of course, the major urban centers of the world, and the green are the road networks in the world. And it reminds us, of course, that every point in the world is connected to every other point in a very intense and direct way right now. Our news in the last 24 hours is of a Liberian citizen who arrived in the United States and is now in hospital with Ebola. This is itself a containable infection in the United States, but it's a reminder for Americans and for everybody else of how everything is transmitted across borders. Trade, finance, ideas, technology, production, disease vectors, pollution, and so many other goods and ills. And so the interconnectedness is our reality. Yet our governance remains so far unable to keep up with the intensity of these interconnections. And one could see 2015 as an attempt to bring at least a part of the global diplomacy in line with the global realities. The key point that I want to talk about is goal-based development. Like the Millennium Development Goals, we've been operating with a framework where the world aims to agree on some shared goals and then to find an institutional mechanism to actually pursue those goals in an effective way. And I believe this is a good model for a complicated world. We seemingly agree on very little today. There are so many fights, arguments, both violent and philosophical, about the world that when we can find areas of clear agreement, we should grasp them. And I believe that in a world that is so complicated as ours, where there is no clear leadership now, because we live in a multipolar world. The era of the bipolar world ended in 1991 with the end of the Soviet Union. The idea that we would be in a unipolar world of the United States leadership, I think quickly was illustrated to be an incorrect assumption. We live clearly in a multipolar world where regional powers are extremely important, where the United States is not the dominant power in the world by any means and is actually tied down in many fruitless military encounters right now that sap its strength, its energy, and its attention. And where we therefore need to find new ways to cooperate without relying on one or two or three powers or one single actor. How can we do that? Whether it's fighting poverty or fighting climate change. And my answer in this talk will be that by having shared goals, we can at least face in the same direction and take actions in the same direction, even if there's no single leader. And I like a statement that President John F. Kennedy made 50 years ago when President Kennedy was pursuing a peace agreement with the Soviet Union, which itself was a very unlikely kind of diplomacy in 1963. Nobody believed that the US and the Soviet Union could actually agree on a treaty, but in fact, because of President Kennedy's insistence and also leadership by his counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, the two sides agreed on the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which proved to be a very important stabilizer in the world that led on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty a few years later. And President Kennedy said something quite important about goals in his own quest for that treaty. He said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And I want to talk about that kind of goal-based development, especially goals for the sustainable development era that we are in today. So next year is the year of setting goals. 3 big international conferences at the head of state level. The first on finance, the second on sustainable development, and the third on climate change, as I mentioned. Now, the world seems very complicated, and this year has also been, for me, I think for all of us, I should say, a rather unnerving and troubling year. Not only has it been a year of instability and spreading war in the Middle East and in Ukraine, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think it's, of course, nothing short of that. But it's become even more unnerving because we're on the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. And I have to confess that I've been worried about 2014 for many years because of that anniversary. It made me very nervous as this year approached, and nothing this year has made me less nervous because unfortunately it turned out to be a year of spreading violence and I think missteps by many of the major powers actually in provoking more tensions rather than easing tensions. So why might it even be possible to imagine achieving goals of development? And the reason, I think, is that we have the ability to achieve some remarkable things in our time. And I want to juxtapose that potential achievement with our great difficulties of finding cooperation to reach that potential. If we look not at all of the difficulties and the challenges of global cooperation, but at the underlying technological realities, we have more ability to solve problems by far than at any time in preceding history, because our tools are more powerful than ever. And our defining capacity of our age is the rise of the information era and the miracles of information technology that now have been a half a century in development. This, of course, is exemplified by the graph that I'm showing here, a graph that is a depiction of what's known as Moore's Law, famous to all of us, the idea that the quality of our microprocessors and our semiconductor technologies has been doubling now since the invention of the integrated circuit in 1959 at a rate of doubling every 18 to 24 months for now 55 years. And this is a quite remarkable phenomenon. It means that in 1961, when the great achievement was to put 2 transistors on an integrated circuit, and that led to a Nobel Prize for that accomplishment. Last year, Intel was able to put 5 billion transistors on the same integrated circuit structure. So we've had a more than 1 billion time improvement in the capacity to store, to process, and to transmit information since 1960. And as everybody knows, every one of our phones, and if we added all the phones in this room, it would probably be a quite large number. Every one of our mobile phones has more computing power than the computers that were used to take the astronauts to the moon in the 1960s. This is the dramatic information revolution that we live in. Well, the point that I want to make is that that information revolution gives us the capacities across every sector of the economy energy systems, finance, healthcare, education, agriculture, smart infrastructure, genomics, many other areas to make breakthroughs in sustainable development so that we could achieve very, very bold goals that we set for ourselves in 2015. This is the good news. The question for us is whether we are smart enough and cooperative enough globally to be able to mobilize all of this technology. I might refer to another quotation of President Kennedy in his inaugural address in 1961, when, with great foresight, he said something very shocking and very stunning. He said, "For mankind holds in its mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." That's the paradox. The ability to solve great, seemingly intractable problems like poverty, but also the danger of this technological age that we wreck the planet, whether through violence or through pollution or through climate change, rather than solving our problems. Now, the good news of the Millennium Development Goal period is that poverty rates have actually come down sharply, as I think people here will know well. And indeed, the Millennium Development Goal #1 called for the rate of poverty to be cut by half between 1990 and 2015. And this goal was actually achieved, if you take the developing countries as an aggregate, already by 2010. In significant part thanks to China, but also because of progress in poverty reduction in Africa and India as well. According to the World Bank data, which are imperfect but useful, in 1990, the developing countries had a poverty rate of 43%. This is the poverty line that the World Bank measures as $1.25 per person per day in 2005 purchasing power adjusted prices. According to that poverty line, 43% of the developing country households were below extreme poverty. By 2010, that poverty rate had declined to about 21%, less than half of the 1990 poverty rate. And by today, my guess is that it's probably about 16 or 17% poverty rate. Unfortunately, the World Bank is too slow. It's 5 years out of date in its poverty measurements. So we're still waiting for the update. But I think Google could probably measure this every day. And if they did, it would probably be a poverty rate of about 16 or 17% at this point. Now, the Millennium Development Goals help this process. Africa, which had been stuck even with rising poverty, has experienced a meaningful drop of poverty, though Africa's poverty rate is still the highest in the world, probably about 40% of households. China went from about 60% poverty rate to under 10% during this period, a most remarkable achievement, probably the fastest such decline in human history. I had thought that the Millennium Development Goals had not played much of a role in China's experience, but I was told recently by a minister in the Chinese government that the Millennium Development Goals actually played an important role in the internal deliberations of the cabinet when it was taking decisions on social policy a decade ago. So I was very happy to hear that it had also played a role in the Chinese context. Well, so fast has the decline of poverty been that SDG #1, when the Sustainable Development Goals are adopted next year, will almost surely call for an end of extreme poverty by the year 2030. This is a kind of goal that would have been seen as too utopian or idealistic in the past, but now many hard-headed people feel that this is quite realistic. Since I wrote a book 10 years ago called The End of Poverty, I have to tell you I believe in that. That this is feasible and that we should set such a bold goal and a timeline to do it. So that is really the good news that propels us into the Sustainable Development Goal period. But the problem is our progress is by no means assured. And this is a graph that illustrates all of the unrest that one finds in different parts of the world. I could add the picture of Hong Kong today, had I updated it this morning. I used to feel a little bit bad that every city I visited seemed to be rioting. And I thought that maybe that was a personal message or something to leave. But then I started to understand that this was just a worldwide phenomenon. There is a great deal of unrest in the world. I have to tell you the story that when my wife and I arrived in Rio de Janeiro a few months ago for an event, I called my mother to tell her where I was, and I said that I'm in Rio. And my mother said, "Oh no, it's very dangerous, there are riots going on." And I said, no, we're standing at the beach, and it's beautiful, and it's very quiet. And don't worry, it's a city of 10 million people, so if something's happening, it's far away from here. And I didn't really convince my mother, but we turned the corner, and suddenly there were 50,000 demonstrators coming towards us. So she was completely correct, and we ran back to the hotel to get out of the way. The truth is there is a lot of unrest. There is a lot of youth unemployment. There is a lot of inequality in our societies. There is a lot of sense of social exclusion. And the result is that even if poverty has come down, there is not a lot of calm. There's not a lot of satisfaction because many societies are grappling with a sense of social exclusion and high inequality and deep uncertainty. And that's why the Sustainable Development Goals will have 3 different components to them. Ending poverty will be one part, but addressing social inequalities will be the second main pillar. Now, if that were not enough, we face an ecological challenge which is absolutely unprecedented for our generation. And this, I think, adds to the complexity of our generational challenge. This is a famous diagram from a justly famous paper in 2009 called The Safe Operating Space for Humanity. And the diagram is called The Planetary Boundaries picture. It's a paper that was published in Nature magazine by a group of leading ecologists who made a basic point. And that is that because of the size of the human population, now 7.2 billion people, by the tremendous level of output per person on average in the world, now $12,000 per person, and therefore $90 trillion of annual output, the pressures on the world's ecosystems at a global scale have reached a tipping point. We've reached the true planetary boundaries such that if we continue to use natural resources the way that we've been using them, we will face very deep ecological crises and potentially tremendously destructive, destabilizing forces to the biosphere, to our ecosystems, to climate, to the oceans. And this paper of planetary boundaries outlined the 10 areas of greatest concern. They go around this circle like a clock. At the very top of the circle at 12 o'clock is climate change. This is our generation's single greatest environmental threat. And it is out of control until today, as you know very well. And then as one circles this wheel, the acidification of the oceans, the ozone depletion, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycling from the heavy use of fertilizers, the depletion of fresh water, the loss of biodiversity, the pollution of the air, and then chemical pollution completes the circle. And the point of this paper is that in every one of these dimensions we face a global scale challenge, unlike anything earlier generations faced. For me, the most dramatic of these is climate change. Climate change, of course, is caused by greenhouse gas emissions that are warming the planet and disturbing the climate. And this is a famous diagram from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which depicts 4 potential scenarios for the future emissions of greenhouse gases. The dark black dots on the left are the actual trajectory of carbon dioxide emissions. And when it reached 10, that means 10 billion tons of carbon released into the atmosphere in 2012 by burning fossil fuels. And the projection of business as usual is the top red line, which says that we will continue to have more and more emissions in future years. The bottom blue line is the safety line. It says that if we want to prevent global warming beyond 2 degrees Celsius, we have to drop the emissions level decisively to less than half of today's level by 2050 and to near zero emissions by 2070. That means a completely new kind of energy system for the world that is not dependent on coal, oil, and gas, or that develops technologies like carbon capture and sequestration that allows us to use the traditional fossil fuels safely by capturing the carbon dioxide before they are released. What this graph depicts is how large a change of direction the world would need in the basic energy technologies in a very short period of time to remain safe. If we don't do it, we're going to have more and more extreme calamities, and the world is filled with them. Last week, the American Meteorological Society published a whole special issue of extreme events in 2013, showing how most of them relate to long-term human-induced climate change, the so-called attribution of these extreme events to human-induced climate change. Well, just in the past year, we have forest fires in Sumatra and other parts of the Indonesian archipelago, unprecedented flooding in Europe, here in the Balkans in May, the biggest drought in modern history in California, leading to the disappearance of the water reservoirs for California, a massive drought in Brazil, massive floods recently in Hiroshima, and massive heat waves in Japan in 2013. And as you know, August of 2014, just 2 months ago, was the warmest August in the history of the instrument record since 1881. So we're already in the midst of this set of extreme events that are spreading more and more around the world. So what to do about all of this? How can we pursue the positive goal of ending extreme poverty, but at the same time addressing inequalities in our societies and growing environmental calamities? The governments of the world in 2012 gave a partial answer. They said we need to make sustainable development the centerpiece of the post-2015 development agenda. We need to define sustainable development as the integrated strategy for integrating economic, social, and environmental objectives together. And we need a set of goals to be called sustainable development goals that embrace these three main objectives. So we are now in the final year of setting those sustainable development goals. I was asked by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to help organize a global network of think tanks and universities. And I'm very happy to say that UN University will be a key bulwark of this network globally. This network is called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It now counts hundreds of universities around the world as new members, though it's only in the starting point. And the idea is to help the world to define and then to achieve these sustainable development goals. And we have recommended a set of 10 goals. The General Assembly Open Working Group recommended a set of 17 goals recently. That number is too large. We have to bring it down to something that is manageable. The Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, will issue a report of recommendations by the end of this year on defining the Sustainable Development Goals, and then the member states will negotiate the final outcome of this for the summit in September 2015. I can guarantee that SDG number 1 will be the end of extreme poverty. That will be a goal. And then goals such as controlling human-induced climate change, protecting biodiversity, creating sustainable cities, promoting social inclusion, and so forth, all with quantitative targets, will be other of the Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, how can we achieve these goals? We have to harness the best of our technologies. We need nothing less than a technological revolution around sustainability. And that's why it's so important that UN University has such a focus on the engineering as well as the policy concepts of sustainability. I myself am a fan of the so-called long wave or technological wave thinking about long-term development, the idea that the history of modern economic growth over the last 2 centuries has been propelled by so-called long or Kondratiyev waves of major technological changes. The first one being the steam engine, then rail and telegraph, then the age of electricity and the internal combustion engine, and so forth. By standard count, we are in the 5th of these great waves with information technology. And the idea that I think is a correct idea is that we need to create the 6th wave of sustainable technological change for achieving sustainable development trajectory of the world. And I would also add that as a macroeconomic theory. I believe that our macroeconomic crisis right now requires not simply Keynesian or aggregate demand or technical measures to propel a new era of development, but actually a technology investment-led era around sustainable technologies. So I am of the view that we must promote low-carbon economies, sustainable agriculture, smart cities, smart grid, as a mechanism for achieving our sustainable development goals, but also as the key to propelling the kind of economic prosperity that we want and the recovery of investment-led growth. I'm not very keen on short-term Keynesian responses to our ongoing macroeconomic crisis. I believe in the need for long-term investment-led growth. And let me add, and I know I'm running out of time, let me add that Japan, as a leading technology country with a special knowledge of energy efficiency, and a country that went through the experience of cleaning very polluted cities and doing this with great success, has a tremendous amount of opportunity for economic growth based on the development and export of sustainable technologies. When I think about the fact that China has the world's most polluted cities right now, and Japan has the track record of making polluted cities among the greenest and cleanest cities in the world, there is a great complementarity of the two economies where both could flourish together through good, strong economic linkages around the sustainable development agenda. So while I don't have time to elaborate, I believe that it's right to say that in order to achieve sustainable development goals, it's correct to say that we're also aiming to achieve the sixth wave of technological change, but this one based on resource-saving, sustainable technologies. And I could say briefly that we have the potential to do this because of the information revolution, which is transforming every other area of science and technology. Nanotechnology, new material science, new energy technologies like organic photovoltaics, which Mitsubishi Chemical is pioneering, and many other such technologies which our new information age could produce. In order to achieve this, we need a more directed, coordinated, global effort to promote these technologies. So one of the things that I'm trying to do on behalf of the Secretary General is to initiate a new set of public-private partnerships around many of the sustainable technologies that will be needed to decarbonize the world's energy systems. And again, I would like to appeal to Toyota, a pioneer of electric vehicles, or to Mitsubishi Chemical, or to many of the world-leading semiconductor companies of Japan, that this is an opportunity for both powerful economic growth, but directed in a way towards the kind of sustainability that is essential. And I'm running out of time, except I had a slide of what Beijing looks like. Now, Tokyo used to look like this 40 years ago, and Tokyo doesn't look anything like this now. And so Japan can help Beijing to see its blue skies once again. And this is actually, quite seriously, a very important economic complementarity that could promote shared economic prosperity, development, and peace in this region. And I am going to stop there, except to close with one more quotation of President Kennedy. You know, when I was 7 years old, I can still remember I wasn't quite 7, I was 6.5, but I remember listening on the radio to the first space voyage of Alan Shepard when he was just shot up a little distance as the first astronaut in space. And just a month before that, or 2 months before that, President Kennedy went to the US Congress. And he said, I urge America to accept the challenge of putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth by the end of this decade. Now that was a kind of remarkable visionary statement of a politician, because the truth was that nobody knew how to do that when he said it. No politician would be allowed by his political advisors to make such a statement anymore. They would tell them, oh, it's much too dangerous, you can't do that. But President Kennedy went and said, let's go to the moon. And the American people liked the challenge. And of course, the space science that resulted from that gave us the satellite age, gave us so many technologies, gave us the semiconductor age, the computer age, and so much more that resulted from this. President Kennedy was asked, why should we go to the moon? It's so hard. And he gave a very famous speech at Rice University in 1962, and I want to close with that statement. He said in this speech, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. And while President Kennedy didn't live to see it, his challenge was fulfilled, of course, because Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in the summer of 1969, just 8 years after the challenge was made. Now, if that could be done in the 1960s, we can certainly achieve the goal of making a safe energy system, safe agriculture, protecting biodiversity, and ending extreme poverty in our time. We should accept that goal. We should be unwilling to postpone it. Thank you very much.